Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of the Makdisi Street podcast. We're delighted to have with us today Daniel Levy, whom I'll introduce in a minute. I just want to say, if you can support us on Patreon, we'd very much welcome your support. And if you can give us a good rating on the social media platforms that you follow us on, that would be helpful as well, not for our vanity, but rather to boost the visibility of the show. Daniel Levy is the president of the U.S. Middle East Project, which emphasizes the Palestine-Israel issue alongside regional conflicts, trends, and geopolitics. From 2012 to 2016, Levy was the director for Middle East and North Africa at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And prior to that, he was a senior fellow and director of the New America Foundation's Middle East Task Force in Washington and a senior fellow at the Century Foundation in New York. So, Daniel, welcome to our show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be with all of you.
We thought we would begin, Daniel, by talking about what's going on catastrophically right now, especially in Gaza, but not only in Gaza, the wider kind of situation that surrounds Gaza as well. A lot of people have talked, including yourself and ourselves, about the differences between Trump and Biden when it comes to the question of Palestine. Around when he took over, his emissary clearly seemed to help facilitate a ceasefire in Gaza, which lasted for a little while. Not the Israelis kept on doing things, but it wasn't the large scale bombing that we're seeing right now. And we seem to be heading in a different kind of direction, at least temporarily. But since then, as we know, the genocide has resumed full bore, basically, right? The starvation and bombing and the horrors that we all see every single day. Trump has since then also declared his intention to take over Gaza, whatever that means. Netanyahu, having resumed the full genocide, says that they're just fulfilling the Trump plan. Separately, having been skeptical of war for a long time, Trump has obviously facilitated the renewal of the war in Gaza, shipped more bombs to the Israelis, resumed the bombardment of Yemen, ratcheting up bellicosity on Iran. So I know that's a lot of things, but in general, what changed from the very beginning of the Trump regime to now, and what's going on? Why have we suddenly entered this new moment of renewed mass destruction and the ratcheting up of bellicosity in American and Israeli policy both?
Yeah, so I think we'd all probably say we're looking at strands of similarity and elements of possible difference, right? In that flow between the two administrations relevant for a conversation that is about the horrific moment we are in. And of course, one could go back in terms of strands of continuity and minor differences across a much broader expanse of time when it comes to US administrations. So the starting point might be a really important distinction to draw. And that's the distinction between the potential and the hope that a Trump administration could bring some kind of sustainable pause in the daily mass killing in Gaza, right? That there could be something approximating a Gaza ceasefire, which is really meaningful in the context of everything we see going on. I don't think anyone was suggesting that a Trump administration would be the on-ramp to ending occupation, ending apartheid, to a broader kind of moment of Palestinian liberation and confrontation between the US and Israel. It was this narrow, but in the current moment, highly significant question of could Trump see through a ceasefire? And it gained some potency because, as you say, Sari, it happened, right? So the deal that, with all its imperfections, the deal that could see the entry of humanitarian aid, which should never have been stopped in the first place, of course, war crime, the desisting of the daily bombing campaign, the daily killing campaign, the ceasefire to deliver those things that had been on the table in a pretty unchanged form for many, many months, that comes into effect at the moment, in fact, on the eve of Trump's inauguration. And so there was this, wow, okay, maybe something different on this question is going on. And fast forward, we are where we are today. And my assessment, at least, of what happened there is that Netanyahu absolutely was convinced, and correctly so, that he had the measure of the Biden administration, that this posed no threat to him and his political calculation. Okay, this isn't the broader question of Palestine, Israel. This is me, Netanyahu, in terms of how I manage this with the domestic challenges that I face, which we can unpack or not. I had Biden exactly where I wanted him, and I was comfortable there. Trump, will he necessarily go along with the way I want to play this? And will his interest align with my personal political interest as Benjamin Netanyahu? And if not, and I go head to head with him, I'm not at all sure who the alpha dog, right? Who the alpha male will be in this situation. Who's the head of a vassal state and who's the head of a superpower? And there was some indications of that in terms of things Trump had said when Netanyahu congratulated Biden when Biden beat Trump first time around. And in that respect, my sense of what happened is Netanyahu looked at this and he decided that something he did not want to do and had successfully avoided doing for the better part of 15 months, or at least since the collapse of the initial kind of ceasefire in November, December 2023, he then decided he should do, which is to agree to the same deal, a deal that he didn't want, a deal that caused him, he could anticipate and did in reality cause him coalition difficulties in his domestic political management. And he did it because he didn't want to get off on the wrong foot with Trump. And then he rushed to become the first leader to get into the White House. He succeeded in doing that. And he wanted to see what's the lie of the land. How can I manage this relationship? And I think he had further causes for concern. I think when the news broke that one of the envoys, Adam Boehler, had direct contacts with Hamas, that set off even more alarm bells ringing, especially when that same envoy Boehler then takes to the TV studios and does a series of interviews with Israeli media channels. He speaks to the three of the news channels in Israel. Yeah, it's not that I'm going to say, these were fantastic interviews. He totally gets it. But he actually said things that you don't often hear from an American official. And you certainly don't ever, let alone often, have an American official owning a direct engagement with Hamas and the validity and usefulness of such a thing. So I think Netanyahu then tests the water and he sees that, maybe we can unpack that more, but I should probably stop talking at this stage. But he sees that he can get back to a comfort zone where he could resume, first of all, the full closure. He can fully violate the terms of the agreement that he had reached, that the Americans were supposed to be guaranteeing, and then he can definitively end any sense of a ceasefire. And the Trump administration thus far has gone along with it. You could say round one to Trump, round two to Netanyahu, round three is up for grabs. I'd like to think it's up for grabs. I'm not at all sure that's the case.
So, Daniel, I mean, following on that, could I just ask you, why would the Trump administration, I mean, just from your experience as a negotiator, as a former negotiator, why would the Trump administration put any pressure on Netanyahu to achieve so-called, I mean, even the ceasefire that was, I mean, and then so quickly just abandon any interest in a ceasefire? I mean, something doesn't make sense. Why would they invest that and then just turn around and say, okay, forget it?
Right. And I have no more privileged access to the inner workings of the Trump administration than any of you guys. So this is an assessment. And in terms of the balance of where that question is, I think for most of us, it would be not a question of why would they give up? Why would they go back to the default of Israel drives the policy? But why would there have been this potential in the first place of an intervention to secure a sustainable ceasefire. And again, the distinction that needs to be drawn is between this narrow question of a ceasefire in large measure in Gaza, the ability of the desperately needed assistance to get in, the prisoner exchanges, etc., to distinguish between that, which is narrow but hugely consequential in a moment like this, when there is a genocidal policy being conducted. So that's hugely consequential. It's distinguished between that and any broader expectation of a Trump administration taking Palestinian rights seriously. And of course, it does the opposite. It creates a permissive environment for an even more permissive environment in terms of Israeli steps in that regard. And so we're trying to unpack how seriously, and it doesn't just apply to Palestine, but there are always going to be exceptional elements when it comes to Palestine, given everything we know and everything we know about American policy. So how seriously are we to take this Trump as the peacemaker, the person who is going to avoid American military entanglements, avoid war, but also try and spread a more general peace in areas where America is not necessarily directly involved with it being the one firing the missiles, it having troops on the ground, etc. And in that respect, to my mind at least, the jury is out on how serious they were. There is a sense that the Trump administration wanted to show and kind of have a knock-on effect here. They didn't like. So first of all, they were influenced on the Israelis being held issue, right? So one of the stories that has gotten a lot of attention inside Israel is that Miriam Adelson, the name is probably familiar, a wife of deceased Sheldon Adelson, massive Republican donor, massive supporters of Israel, owners of the free and large circulation Israeli daily, Israel Hayom, that she had very much gotten involved with some of the families of those being held in Gaza and was very much pushing this, and obviously has access and has the ear of the president. So that might be one reason. The other is, Biden had failed. I'm not going to fail. This can be an early demonstration that we do this differently, and that the Democrats have really done everything to box themselves into a position where they are the war party. Coming out the traps, the sense is that Trump might be serious about this. And the question as of now is, do we have the definitive proof that this was a blip? There's no going back to this. They will adhere to an Israeli position which offers no openings for negotiations. It's totally unrealistic. It's not something that they could achieve. Or is there another possible snap moment where Witkoff or other folks in the Trump administration turn around and say, you had your time to do this. You told us that if we put more pressure on Hamas, they would agree to these terms. It hasn't happened. We want to get a ceasefire again. And that's, I think, where we are. There are other issues that one could throw into the mix, like if this does boil down to Witkoff being the lead negotiator and he's now doing the Ukraine file, so is that a case that they took their eyes off the ball, etc.? But Netanyahu, I think what we've seen is Netanyahu is pressurable. He doesn't want to be the guy that gets on the wrong side of Trump because of his political calculation. He was seriously spooked when a different envoy in the Trump administration, Adam Boehler, was revealed to have had direct contacts with Hamas. He then goes and defends and justifies and explains those contacts in TV interviews, not only in the US, but in Israel, with 3 main Israeli news channels. And that has Netanyahu anxious, because the easiest way of exposing who are the recalcitrant party is to do the thing that the Biden folks refuse to do throughout, which is you speak to both parties. So Netanyahu, and as we're speaking, and so this will now be in the rearview mirror by the time people hear this, if I can say it, Netanyahu is about to have his second meeting with Trump. And I think he will constantly be wanting to get an assessment of what is my wiggle room. Again, because Biden was a known and easily moved, maneuvered, managed quantity. Trump is apparently not those things. And in that clash of kind of alpha dogs, alpha males, whatever, Netanyahu might not be able to play the I'm the superpower here, you're the vassal state card as easily as he could under a Biden administration.
Daniel, this is. I want to just go back a little bit, and if you could just give us a little bit of a background in terms of Israeli negotiations. I mean, I'm in Beirut now, and from what we see from here, the idea of negotiation, conflict resolution, that whole kind of thing, it gives a certain idea, a certain image that you have, two sides sitting down trying to negotiate something, supposedly in good faith at some level or the other. And from what we see here over and over and over again, the negotiation obviously is not really, for example, between the Israelis and the Lebanese, directly or indirectly. It's between the Israelis and the Americans that happens to have the object of Lebanon or Syria or the Palestinians or somebody else. And so the relationship is purely an American-Israeli one rather than an Israeli-Palestinian or Israeli-Lebanese or Israeli-Syrian or Israeli anything else. So that's one thing. I wanted to get your feedback on that. The second thing is, do the Israelis ever negotiate in good faith? Is there such a thing as good faith? And who is it that we should be looking at if we're on the outside looking in? Who among the Israelis, and in your long experience, I mean, who is it that we should be looking to aside from Netanyahu? Are there what one might call some kind of moderating influence, or is it purely? I mean, is it the families of the hostages? Is it some kind of local constraints, or is it purely Netanyahu and how much he can push and how much he can get out of Trump or Biden or somebody else? Just what is the lay of the land within the Israeli body politic itself?
I think it's correct not to characterize this as negotiations in a way that we would traditionally understand that terminology. And so I think one kind of flits between. An awful lot of the time, these are negotiations between Israelis and themselves. And I think quite often that was a correct characterization of Oslo and of other talks, including at key moments, these talks. And I think that held for most of the duration of the Biden administration. And let me come back to that in a minute. Sometimes this is Israel-US, and I think it's correct to characterize the adherence or otherwise to the details of the Lebanon ceasefire in this current iteration. The Israelis agree to something, they don't implement it, but the US endorses the Israeli rewriting of the terms of an agreement, and therefore that's how we continue to see things unfold, because that's the nature of this thing. I've just paused because my dog was barking, and I don't know if you picked that up. I apologize on behalf of the dog. That then raises the question, well, what about the third element? What about the Palestinians, the Palestinian actor that is part of any given negotiation? What about the Lebanese, etc.? And here, as in most instances, because this isn't an Israeli acknowledgement that there is a better path that requires coming to terms with another party, there is a legitimacy that it is acknowledged of that other party's interests to a greater or lesser degree, and that Israel can achieve through negotiation things that it wants to achieve. Because the Israeli disposition, the Israeli approach is to maximize what it can get, there is not an enlightened self-interest understanding of another party here. There is simply, at any given moment, what does the power dynamic allow? And that power dynamic has an internal Israeli component, it has an Israeli-US component, and then it has a third component, which is often the weakest of those three legs, which is what can the other party, either the direct party in an asymmetric as it is throughout this relationship with Palestinians, with Lebanon, with Syria, whoever. And there could be a fourth leg to this, but that's mostly lacking at the moment. The fourth leg could be, well, the world doesn't just consist of Israelis, Americans, and the protagonists from the other side. The world consists of other Arab states who aren't directly involved in these confrontations, and the world consists of a whole host of other states. If that can be brought into the picture to impact that power imbalance, then you have a different equation. Thus far, it hasn't happened. To the extent to which it has happened, it's almost exclusively been a slew of countries in the global south who have tried to take the international legal and other routes. South Africa, of course, being the example that one would most shine a light on, given what they've done in the ICJ. And I don't want to pretend that's achieved nothing, because to the extent to which you see some hesitation on the Israeli side, it is somewhat a product of the concerns as to where the ICJ, the ICC, the international legal architecture may go. The bit that, if I can, I'll maybe just touch on, and then maybe we pick this up further, is that internal Israeli piece. And I don't think the question is who on the Israeli side. There's not, some kind of, as I said, the kind of enlightened Israeli interlocutor waiting in the wings. No leader of a Zionist political party has criticized the terms of Israel's engagement in Gaza, what it has done, or elsewhere. No Zionist political party voted against the closure of UNRWA, for instance, voted against a bill put forward on July 18th to put forward by Netanyahu that there could be no Palestinian state even. So I think what we're looking at is the dynamics inside Israel. And that's where maybe the Achilles heel is. As you say, that cohort of Israelis for whom the deprioritization of the hostage issue is something that they don't accept. Israel's economic resilience, and those who see that as a problem, because Israel doesn't run a resistance economy, it runs a globally plugged in economy. Or, and I would especially put an emphasis on this, those Israelis who are not questioning the mission in Gaza, but are questioning the priorities that Netanyahu sets. How much is a person who's been called up for their second, third, fourth term of reserve duty, do they feel that they're not doing this in order to secure or defend Israel, but they're doing this for a Netanyahu narrow political agenda? And that I think is where the polarization inside Israel, not around treatment of Palestinians primarily, and sometimes often not at all, but that polarization opens the question of overreach and of how far Israel can continue to go down this path, which is a crucial question given everything that's going on.
Dan, I just want to follow up on this. I think it's a crucial point there where you're saying, I think it's important for all us to remember this idea that even prior to October 7th, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that kind of that split, those huge protests or demonstrations against Netanyahu, the so-called liberals and the kind of hardliners, etc. But that in both those cases, they had nothing to say about the occupation of Palestine, etc. Within the current configuration, and we're going to talk, I think, later about Israeli society as a whole, but even within this kind of the governmental, institutional, bureaucratic setup, we hear, is there a constraint that the army itself or the intelligence services or all those that are kind of following the military aspect? I mean, again, from the Lebanon part of this war, it seemed fairly clear that there was this kind of confrontation, or there was this thing between what Netanyahu and his people wanted to do in South Lebanon versus the limitations that the army and the others were putting on them, which is kind of an intra kind of Israeli, I don't know, struggle or fight or something that's going on. Does this exist, or is this not really the case? Is it a serious constraint to Netanyahu? What the army people are saying, what the bureaucracy is saying, what the intelligence services are saying, or is that something Netanyahu doesn't take seriously? That's just something that if he gets the okay from Trump or from Biden or from the Americans, he just moves ahead and then expects the other guys to fall in line. So I'm just wondering, because there's just this sense of what role do these other institutions play? And over the years, even prior to October 7th, has that been weakening? As we hear about, well, the right wing is increasingly taking over, the settlers are getting more, influential. Ben Gvir and these kinds of people go from, apparently from the margins to the center. Is that something which is here to stay, and Netanyahu is playing on this? And there's no reason to expect that this is going to fall back. And so therefore, should we all be adjusting how we think about negotiations, how we think about what an Israeli interest is or isn't? Has that fundamentally changed? Or is this just, there's like a momentary thing, and Netanyahu is playing to Ben Gvir, and please stay in the government, don't go in the government? Is there a fundamental shift that we need to take into account? Or is just politics, it goes up, it goes down, and we see what happens kind of thing? I hope that's a bit clear what I'm trying to say.
I know it is, and the danger here is always that in asserting that I think one is in the throes of a quite significant and fundamental shift, not to attribute to those words some kind of naive sense that there's a kind of golden era liberal Israel waiting in the wings. If only that wing of liberal Zionism could come back into power, everything would be hunky-dory, which I doubt is what you were suggesting, Karim. But, just no, it wasn't. So I think one can hold both of those things at once. That there is no establishment camp of equality or camp of stripping away a regime of ethno-nationalist supremacy. That doesn't exist in the establishment. What you do have in the establishment is, and I would probably call it, a more realist camp within the confines of what a Zionist establishment can give you, and a camp that says, do away with all of that. The geopolitics have shifted exclusively in our direction. Victory is in reach. And the way I describe it is probably the apartheid is not enough camp. The victory cannot be achieved if there is still something of recognizable volume, traction, and salience that is called the Palestinian cause in the greater land of Israel, and the attempt to assert a degree of regional hegemony on the part of Israel. Now, I think we're now really in the moment of determining whether that is overreach or not. My bet would be it is. That's not necessarily a conclusion that people within a significant cohort of the establishment are drawing for themselves. That's also where that fault line inside Israel comes back into play. If I can unpack some of the ingredients of that. So one is, to the extent to which there was something of a consensus in Israeli security establishment circles, again, not around how international law applies to Palestinians, not Palestinian rights, but none of those things, but something of a consensus around a more incremental approach. elements of realism. The religious national camp, the national religious camp in Israel, identified that as a major impediment to them achieving this, let's call it total victory in their terms, right? And so a decision was made a generation ago that they would encourage their kids to serve. They would encourage their kids to sign up to officer training camp. They would encourage them to build careers. And that's what we see in play today. So if you see the current head of the central command in the Israeli in the Israeli military, in the Israeli army, in charge of the West Bank, that person comes from that world. And that increasingly the upper ranks of the security establishment are going to be drawn from that cohort. But it's still in play. And so you have had these moments over the last 18 months where the significant elements of the security establishment, the negotiators from the Shin Bet and the Mossad, were leaking against Netanyahu, were saying Israel is undermining the talks. This was coming from them. The military correspondents in the Israeli media were getting this directly. Where you had a significant cohort of the public, and this was borne out in polls, supportive of a deal, supportive of prioritizing the release of the hostages over continuing the military mission, so-called in Gaza, where you had kind of crescendos in the protest movement. And so it looked like this was doable. One of the remarkable things was when those moments existed and Netanyahu felt, the balance is turning against me domestically, the Biden administration conspired to somehow put its thumb down on the scale in favor of Netanyahu continuing. I think the best example is when Blinken shows up after Biden has kind of put forward the outlines of a plan in the summer. Blinken shows up and he says, Netanyahu accepts it, Hamas doesn't. This continuous just willingness to lie. They thought they were lying just for Israel, but they were lying also for Netanyahu and his own political interest. And if you zoom out further, you see what perhaps it's not remarkable. At one level, it does kind of seem something that should at least make us momentarily stop in our tracks. The level of protest that there was against that so-called judicial overhaul that existed prior to October 7th in the year leading up to that, under this Netanyahu government, in the 9 months leading up to it, the protests have never reached that crescendo since October 7th. Okay, partly that's a society mobilized in a conflict moment. But partly, and mostly, this is about Jewish Israel, the Jewish Israeli community saying, wait a minute, now you're coming after our democracy. Because Israel was never a democracy. I'm going to shock you. Israel was never a democracy for Palestinians, right? Whether inside the 48 lines and certainly not living under permanent belligerent illegal occupation. But it was that sense of now they're coming for me. I'm still not interested in them, but I am interested in me. I would, though, just acknowledge that throughout, whether it's prior to October 7th or in the protests since October 7th, there is a cohort. It's a small cohort. It's pretty much a dissident cohort that are the anti-occupation, anti-apartheid bloc who are trying to draw those connections. And there's one character in the hostage family mix, the mother of one of those being held, Einab Zangalkel, whose son is Matan. And it's because she comes from kind of classic right-wing Israeli stock. And it feels like she has undergone a process of realization of what this regime is about. And sometimes she espouses that. And I don't want to get Pollyannish or naive in suggesting the pace or the extent of change. But I think somewhere below the surface, there is a larger than acknowledges it, larger than is perhaps themselves conscious of it, cohort of Israelis who know this is not going well. And the number of people who I speak to who say, this is maybe it's time to go. I'll say one more thing. Someone like Tom Segev, he just gave an interview to Haaretz. He's an Israeli historian, author. And, 80 years old, he turns around and says, maybe I was wrong. Zionism isn't working.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, that's true. That's what Tom Segev said. And I guess better late than never. But I guess the question really is, when you said, Daniel, when you say Israel is engaged in, or you feel that there's overreach on the part of the Israelis, can you briefly explicate why you say that? And then the related question before we move on to the question I think Sadie wants to ask is, what are Israeli interests? But what is the role of, where does the resistance or the so-called axis of resistance come into all this? What role have they played in terms of where we are today? In terms of how, in other words, how you read the Israeli domestic scene and these various fractures within Israel.
Yeah, the sense of overreach is, you don't have an endless pool of reservists, for instance. Right now, Israel is conducting this campaign of horrors. We're back to, double, triple on many days digit Palestinian deaths on any given day, killings. They're doing this without a massive reservist call-up. They're doing this, and this is partly why Israel isn't incurring losses on its own side, without going in significant numbers. It's missiles, it's drones, it's bombs, it's an aerial campaign. Now, I think that if Netanyahu chooses to do so, stares this down, and if push comes to shove and he sends out those call-up notices, I think enough will show up. There is real hesitation amongst the political leadership and the military leadership to put that to the test. They also know that when you do that, you bring right back front and center into the Israeli debate the fact that the ultra-Orthodox don't serve. So it's another fault line, another tension. And what I'm suggesting is that in a society, in a polity, in an economy where the success story has, in significant measure, I don't want to say exclusively, where the success story that they would tell us rests, like I said, in significant measure in that cohort of Israelis who are uncomfortable with Ben Gvir and Smotrich, with the direction of travel of the Likud, with Netanyahu, who have options to be overseas. So if you look at economic indicators, it's not nearly dramatic enough to cause a change in behavior, right? But if one looks at trend lines, the trajectory this is going on, if you look at the degree of polarization, if you look at the question marks surrounding troop replacement levels, Israel hasn't incurred that many losses. To a large degree, that's because you're a very short helicopter evacuation from high level medical care. If you're Israeli fighting in Gaza, and you're able to get that. But nonetheless, if you look at injuries, and significant injuries have been sustained. So if you look at that pool to draw on, take the fact that 20% of the Israeli population is Palestinian Israeli. When you put all of those things together, and then you superimpose that on the extent of the ambition of this total victory vis-a-vis Palestinians, the ambition in Lebanon, the ambition in Syria, the ambition regionally. Not only would I say, is it legitimate to ask, is there a snapping point? But it's more important to ask, what accelerates that snapping point? And what is not being done to play in those fractures, to play in those fissures and divisions and tensions and vulnerabilities inside Israel to bring forward that snapping point. So that's what I'm trying to get at. Again, without suggesting it happens tomorrow, but these things can often kind of move quicker than one expects. And in terms of the axis of resistance, look, when I said this is between Israelis and themselves, Israelis and the US, the excessive quiescence and absence of the rest of the world, and in particular the leverage that does exist in the region, as it's not being brought to bear on not only stopping the current horror, but on the broader question of the apartheid regime that's maintained. The other vector is Palestinians and resistance and resilience, which, there's armed resistance and then there's just the resilience. So I do think the Israeli side was not expecting Hamas to be able to hold out in the way in which it did. The scenes that one saw during the ceasefire, during the those exchanges, the releases of the Israelis being held, were quite a rude awakening. The crisply pressed Al-Qassam Brigade uniforms, for instance. So one has to acknowledge that is a significant factor. The unwillingness on the part of Palestinians to up sticks and leave, that there hasn't been a rush on the Egyptian border en masse, that people are, so, I'll stop there, but you see what I mean.
Daniel, on this question of, the contradiction between Israel's ambitions and Israel's capabilities, I mean, as you're saying, the costs have been much higher than we're often led to assume, both military casualties, the destruction of the Israeli economy, the hundreds of thousands of people who've left either the northern settlements or the country altogether, the total evisceration of Israel's standing in the world, at least in the Western world. I mean, all that's, I mean, these are huge costs that they've paid already. Okay, now they're bombing. As you said, they're bombing largely from the air. So essentially, it's a cost-free operation. They can just massacre people from the air, and there's no. America covers all of the the material costs. There's no risk. Israeli planes aren't going to get shot down over Gaza, so they could just go on doing this and doing it and killing and killing and killing and killing. So the question, like, even in the short term, what exactly are they trying to accomplish other than, I don't know, deferring? I mean, yeah, are they just? I mean, that they can go on killing and killing and killing. Is the end of this just killing for the sake of killing at this point? Because clearly, if they go back in on the ground, they're going to encounter resistance. We're back to where we were. So what do they? What is their? Do they have a plan, or is it just they keep seeing the different pulls and pushes of tension, and then they go according to that, or do they have? Does Netanyahu have a vision of some kind for what they're trying to accomplish, other than killing for the sake of killing? He said, we want to fulfill the Trump plan. Is that true, or is it just bullshit in the way that it probably is for Trump as well? I mean, what do you make? What are they trying to do basically right now, other than just killing?
So first of all, what they say at face value, just to acknowledge it and then quite quickly dismiss it, is what they're doing is creating the conditions for the release of the Israelis, putting on more pressure. That's how you do that, and then to lead to the what they call the total defeat, dismantling, demilitarization, removal of Hamas, and then a long-term plan of de-radicalization. I don't take that seriously on any of those levels that they have stated. I think there is deep skepticism that goes far beyond the protesters inside Israel as to the attainability of those things, not the morality. Again, I don't want to paint a picture of where Israel is at that is not real, but in terms of the achievability of those things. So then let's throw some other things into the mix. First of all, as you said, look, there is an ideological driver to this, which wants to have this is the total victory, that you physically remove, either by virtue of people no longer being alive or by virtue of people no longer being physically there. And of course, it doesn't end with Gaza. It goes without saying that we're also looking at something quite unprecedented in scale in the West Bank, and that very much is the intention to keep driving that forward. So there is an ideological goal here, which is to achieve things that are irreversible and that fundamentally change the landscape of this conflict. And I do think that is a significant driver. Then one can never forget the fact that is Netanyahu's political calculation. Okay, because there is, as we've said, Netanyahu's coalition was weakened as a consequence of the ceasefire agreement in January. It has subsequently been strengthened following his evisceration of that ceasefire, his ending of the ceasefire. And Netanyahu is constantly looking at that political calculation. He also, of course, is in court facing various charges. And Netanyahu has set himself up as the wartime leader. That is the path back. That's the path to avoiding accountability politically, internally, for October 7th. But, and this is again where it's important. First of all, it's important not to lose hope, but it's important for that hope to be grounded in more than simply the absence of hope, right? And not losing that. And that's where I if you look at what it would take, because Trump put forward that Gaza Riviera plan and immediately made very clear, not a single American dollar would go towards it, and there'd be no American troops involved on it. So what we're actually saying here is that Israel either has to convince Egypt, and subsequently when it comes to Palestinians in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, perhaps in 48 as well, Jordan, Israel would have to physically conduct that removal. If they want to subcontract it to mercenary third-party forces, even like the physical aspect of transporting people, then it would have to pay for that. It would then probably have to pay third countries to take in. There's these reports that US officials have spoken to Somalia, I think Sudan. Who's going to pay for that? I think the expectation would be Israel does, or that they're going to get the Gulf states to pay for this. So this is built
UAE.
are there even limits to what they're willing to do? So this is built on layers of, I would call it layers of overreach and of not being realistic. And the more you go down that path, the more let's get back into that polarization in Israel. Do Israelis want to see the abandonment of the Israelis held there, more days of reserve duty, their taxpayer dollars going into this? Because this is the part.
But Daniel, you've been in this business for decades, correct? I mean, all of us have been, either living or experiencing or witnessing all this for years and years and years. Have you ever seen a situation where there's this kind of alleged ceasefire, whether it's in Lebanon or in Gaza or anywhere else, where the Israelis constantly keep, there's been no ceasefire. They have violated the ceasefires constantly, and they keep expanding. We've never had a situation like this. So what keeps you thinking about? I mean, I understand the point about overreach, but they seem pretty confident that there's absolutely no deterrent.
A few things. because it is bleak. And I want to acknowledge up front that, had you have said to me, this is how bad things can get, this is how far they can go, under these circumstances, there would still be this degree of impunity, I wouldn't have expected it. I think all of us are in systemic shock as to the inability, despite everything, ICJ, ICC, how exposed all of this is, shifts in culture, right? I mean, Palestinian cultural reference points, you can win an Oscar, you can, have a Snow White movie get castigated for the role that Gal Gadot plays in it. And yet here we are with an overriding sense of helplessness. So that's where I think a few things come into play. One of them is, it's interesting that despite the Israeli approach to the rulings of the ICC and the ICJ, it permeates. Now, again, these are things that take time, but you do now see attempts to hold individual Israelis who have documented themselves conducting war crimes in their own social media accounts. And people have been, there's the Hind Rajab Foundation, the work that they've done, making sure that this isn't lost. When people clean their social media accounts, it's captured somewhere. And when, person X who did atrocity Y then decides, hey, I'll take some time off, I'm going to go to Brazil or whatever, it can catch up with them. More broadly, you see a debate, you see actually now some investigations happening internally in the IDF. I'm not saying they're going to properly hold people accountable, but you see we're a bit vulnerable, we're a bit exposed on that ICC front. This doesn't necessarily just end with arrest warrants against Gallant and against Netanyahu. The speculation now is, how long can they keep the total turn-off of humanitarian aid supplies going into Gaza without this stirring problem? So, okay, nowhere near enough. A chipping away at these things which doesn't add up to anything like enough. But that brings us to how do you accelerate those things? And for me, central to the question of making that change, making that acceleration, is, where is the Palestinian national movement? Is that you have this gaping vacuum where there should be an ANC-like structure driving a campaign of accountability and sanctions. And instead, you have civil society having to take this load on its back. And civil society isn't equipped to do that. State actors are not going to be more Palestinian than the PLO. Okay? And the PLO isn't driving this. The PA, the State of Palestine, that whole structure. Now, I'm not saying that if you manage to flip that leadership into something more strategic and challenging, that the morning after, a whole load of state actors sign up. By the way, some have signed up even in the absence of a serious Palestinian national address. This Hague group that was established with 8 different states to really push, we're not going to be involved in any trade, we're not going to be involved in arms, we're not going to have our ports used. It's not enough. But how do you continue to build that? How do you bring into play more actors? And what new vulnerabilities in that respect does this kind of a Trump administration create? Because as this Trump administration, I think, yes, it's causing people to say, yeah, what can we do to not fall foul, to not have the highest level of tariffs? But it's also causing people to recognize that whatever we do, America is going to be a problem, including allies. And the one country that is so singularly dependent on that is Israel. So I think there are opportunities that open up here, but those are opportunities that are really hard to exploit without a unified movement leading this. Including how do you embarrass Arab states? How do you cajole them to act?
Yeah, no, I think this is important, and we're going to have we've had episodes about the Arab states, and we're going to have others, because that's a whole other issue, which is quite vexing to us, and I think to all of us.
Kareem, so obviously, if I can jump in, so I won't go into, that's not where I'm going to, but you can't disconnect it, right? That's what I'm saying is, this has to be taken as a whole. So you have to plug that thing into everything else we've been talking about. Sorry, Kareem.
No, absolutely, 100%. I mean, the role of the Arab states, in particular some of the Gulf states, Egypt, Jordan, those around it, in terms of this unfolding genocide, mirrors and even exceeds, what we're seeing in the failure of the international order and the supposed international liberal order. And we're moving, and this is what I want to shift to. I mean, we're moving from a kind of clear a discussion that we used to have here in Lebanon and Palestine, I think other places, where you talk about double standards or the failure to implement international law or something along these lines. But there's at least the kind of recognition that it exists in some form or the other, into something where it's we're back to kind of direct force, and we see this, for example, in Lebanon. And so the response to it, of course, being resistance, including violence and military resistance, but different forms of resistance. The way in which this is being dealt with, again, for example, in Lebanon, we have Ortegas, who's just, I think she may have just left, but she just came to Lebanon to try once again to impose a certain kind of order onto Lebanon, to basically very brashly, in a kind of Trumpian style, to tell Lebanese, you can do this, you can't do this, you have to do this, you have to do that. And there's a very, and Lebanese politicians are running around trying to scramble to kind of to try to absorb it, because they understand that if they do what she wants or what Trump wants, the whole society will fall apart. You end up in a civil war. So there's a kind of an absorption attempt as things kind of go forward. But I'm interested. So we have questions of resistances. We have questions of the Arab states and the international order. And then we have the Israeli society. And I want to come back to that. From what we've seen, unless things have changed recently, which I doubt somehow, there was an overwhelming number of Jewish Israelis who supported the genocide from the beginning until now, as far as I can tell. You have, I think polls showed that 2/3 of Israelis supported even the question of the famine, just cutting off food and water and all this to Palestinians inside Gaza in support of this kind of genocide. How is it that, I'm not sure there's an answer to this, but I mean, how does one think about moving away from a discussion like people like Bernie Sanders said it's all about Netanyahu, and it is to an extent at a political level, into talking about Israeli society? There is a point where, at a certain point, when an overwhelming number of people in a particular society are supporting genocide in its full view, it's no longer just a question of one operation or one issue that one can maybe debate and discuss, but something over a year and a half, including invasions of Lebanon, including the Gaza, including what's going on the West Bank, all the things that we're seeing, including the land grabs in Syria, which are, all of this together. How does one explain Jewish Israeli society today without coming to a conclusion that it is a full-on, in support of genocide? And I personally, I've heard stories that they don't have access to internet, or they don't watch, or they're not, or TV doesn't show that. I can't accept that. I've heard it from several people. The Israeli television, state television, does not show what's going on in Gaza, as though Israelis don't have access to TikTok and the Instagram and whatever, all the rest of it, just like the rest of us do. Can you just give us an understanding? Are we missing something? Is there some nuance? Is there something that at least I cannot see that can tell us that Jewish Israeli society is not all on genocidal?
By the way, Daniel, just to add to Kareem's question, you may have seen this, but last fall, the Lemkin Institute said that Israel is a genocidal state backed by a genocidal society, which is the question Karim is asking too. Like, what are we dealing? Are we dealing with genocidal society? And of course, we'll come to the follow up. Well, what if so? Then what?
Right. So, just briefly before we get into that, the thing that we were touching on just before, I can take one sentence on that, which is the more Israel proves itself to be a revisionist state in the region, which is actually beginning to be recognized as constituting, by a broader set of actors in the region, as constituting a bigger threat, potentially to their own interests. You know, the most retrograde of regional leaders is not happy when their publics are watching this on their screens for 18 months on end. That's not good for them. That's not good for the attempt to move on to an economic agenda of 2030, etc. So the more Israel goes into this overreach, goes into the hegemonic agenda, the more it is leaning into something which makes it difficult to handle. And of course, what we don't have, what we're trying to do here is you don't have an ANC at the center, frontline states who are backing it, and then a network of global solidarity and global South. You have the third ring of that. And so at the moment, we're trying to somehow build the vacuum that exists in those first two rings of ANC and frontline states just from the global solidarity movement and the actions in the global South. Okay. I, to a certain extent, struggle to explain the extent to which we see those signs of a genocidal society backing a genocidal state. I can do it, right? I can talk about the dehumanization. I can talk about the entire model of partition and separation, meaning you don't have to think about Palestinians and their humanity. I can do that through years of inculcating permanent trauma inside Israeli society. You know, everyone's the next Nazi. The way that has been worked to play out inside Israel. You know, Yeshayahu Leibowitz, an Israeli philosopher, warned of the Nazification of Israel after 1967. We can talk about how, in a supposedly free media environment, how not only censored, but self-censoring, how mobilized the media is. And it's shocking. I mean, Channel 14, and they're not alone, play the role of Radio Rwanda, the role that played in the Rwandan genocide. One can talk about something that is of more recent vintage, that of course Israelis have access to internet and can if anyone wanted to spend a few minutes delving into what's really going on, it wouldn't be difficult. That's not where the algorithm is going to take them, right? So we do have this new phenomenon, and it's been exposed how the uses of social media were driven to back the genocide against the Rohingya in Myanmar. Okay, one has all of those things. For me, it's still not enough. For me, there's a point at which I'm still at a loss to understand this. Yes, we can go to the place that says in a settler colonial society, the seed of genocide will always be there against the native population. And perhaps that gets us further, because the more threatened that society feels, the more violent the convulsive reaction is going to be. I would also lean heavily into the idea that much as Israeli society is not going to thank anyone for imposing costs and consequences, for sanctioning, I think it would have a real effect. Because the other thing that this lands in an Israeli society which was told, and this is the period I remember best, in the 90s and just after, the argument wasn't made primarily around Palestinians are equals, Palestinians are human, Palestinians have rights, etc. The argument was primarily made, we won't be able to get away with it. After the first Intifada, right? The argument was the world won't accept it. And that argument was used in various iterations ever since. And Israeli society got used to the idea that that was BS, that we can get away with anything. There's no cost. And I think one of the most, if not the most dramatic moment of Israelis believing we can get away with anything was the Abraham Accords. Was the Arab world hates the Palestinians as well. So we're in good company when we see Palestinians as subhuman. When you begin to bring all of those things together, you can begin to build that composite picture of how we have gotten to this moment. And therefore, you have to unpick and unravel as many of those elements, because unless there is, unless Israel faces a military challenge that gets it to recalibrate what it is doing, this is going to have to be about how a politics of a different incentive structure and a different kind of strategic challenge to these horrors eventually lead to some element of recalibration in Israeli society, some unraveling of how each of these layers reinforces each other. We've got to get to a place where layers actually pull, you're pulling the rug out of this layer or that layer.
Daniel, in a way, I mean, with this discussion of Israeli society and going on what you just said, a few minutes ago about the status of we're basically talking here about a settler colonial society. There's nothing unique about Jewish Israeli society in that sense. It's like we've seen this movie before. It's gone back a couple hundred years. There's nothing original about it in that sense. And then we're on the terrain here of Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, and we know how these societies, what it takes to transform them. And Fanon, Wretched of the Earth, tells us exactly what's necessary to transform settler colonial society. And negotiation is not one of the things that will work. In fact, on the contrary, according to Fanon, it's the exact opposite, right? And we know from not just from Césaire, we also know from C.L.R. James, colonial societies have they're something sort of, they're miswired in a way. They don't understand that they have to reconcile themselves to realities. They start transcending the sense of what's possible, what's necessary, and the ability to accommodate themselves to other human beings around them, right? So none of this looks, particularly promising. I mean, in a sense that if we're dealing with a genocidal society with a classic 18th and 19th century settler colonial mentality, do you see any hope? And that maybe you don't. I don't know. It's certainly becoming harder and harder for anybody else to see hope. So I don't blame you if you don't see hope. But what do you like? Where are we going from here? Are we just going towards brute extermination? Is it are we in Conrad territory? Exterminate the brutes? Where are we going here? How does this end? I remember being on Jazeera interviews with you like 20 years ago, and then we were talking about one state and two state and this kind of thing, but now it seems like we're in a different domain here. So where do you see things going from here?
Yeah, and I mean to initially at least respond by doubling down on what you just shared. Netanyahu proudly owns this language. He did it again, supposedly at a conference on anti-Semitism, hosted with anti-Semites for Israel, hosted with the representative of the far right from across Europe, and he talks about the struggle of barbarians against barbarians, of the civilized. So I at least try and say that we, in this moment, which looks zero sum, is this a society that is in a genocidal moment? And as you say, it would be historically inaccurate to describe a golden era, or that this is a total aberration. But this is certainly an aberration of degree. and of the nature of the action being undertaken. The way I see it at the moment is that in this zero-sum equation that Israel has set up, we're in a race now between Israel succeeding in creating irreversible facts, which, at the spear point is killing and physical removal and displacement of Palestinians, a race between that and a certain implosion of Israeli society, which has kind of been the other part of our conversation, right? Now, where I go with that is, in terms of how one could step back from it, is I don't see the physical removal of the Israeli Jewish population. Now, I would also argue that, and this is where I kind of would say, of course, anti-Zionism can't be anti-Semitic, but I care about the well-being also of that community, of that Israeli Jewish community, not the well-being of their ethno-supremacist regime. In fact, I would argue that the two are antithetical. Israeli Jews will not. I don't think they can succeed. Okay, I think even if you manage to go quite far down that road, and we're already way further than obviously than any of us would like, but probably than we imagined you could get. That even if you got a lot further down that road, I don't see quiet in the surrounding area. I don't see this ultimately just being absorbed and accepted, and Israeli Jews having security. And as I say, anyway, for me, that's not something that one can in any way wish for or endorse or feel anything other than abhorred by. So that's what brings me back to, if that presence is permanent, if it's not zero sum, but that permanent presence is not living in a supremacist regime, then one has to posit the alternative. And that's why I do feel that this gaping vacuum, the absence of the Freedom Charter, the absence of that liberation movement that is broad, that poses the strategic challenge to this, is not the only missing ingredient, but is a crucial missing ingredient. And then you, of course, as I said, one has to look at what are the islands of people who are going to get on board with that, of those who will fully align. Then what are the spaces where you can kind of pull Israelis partly in that direction, and then you kind of get this reverse trend. You get this movement away from where that society is at the moment, and that's that requires things to do with the pressure that's applied. As I've said, I really insist on how consequential impunity is for Israel's ability to go down this path, and how consequential for shifting that direction of travel would be the change in an incentive structure. And then that's about building layers of peeling away, rather, layers of support for the regime. That doesn't look possible right now. But I think there are circumstances where that does become possible. I personally would err on the side of that being a one-state thing, but I realize the non-partition based paradigm. But I realize that today, to speak to people on either side of that divide about living together on this land, and speaking to Palestinians in particular, is probably the least propitious of circumstances under which to do so. But that's not we're not in a solution moment. That's not tomorrow, right? This is about holding out a vision of a, let's say, decolonized space. But to get to an absorbability of that, other things will have to change. And foremost amongst them, I'm suggesting, is the extent to which Israelis can feel that their lives can be so damn comfortable under these circumstances. And that, for me, brings it to all the vulnerabilities that we've discussed and the ones that we haven't discussed. You spoke once to a friend, albeit he's a Liverpool supporter, Tony Caron, and that how can one have normal sport with a society that's in the throes of carrying out a genocide? That shouldn't be happening. And I sometimes feel that the solidarity movement can be more focused on particular strategic goals, and also that it's horses for courses. There are things that we can try and achieve in America in these circumstances where we don't have to, we can't be maximalist all the time. One's in America, right? For those who are in America. If you're in Europe, there are things that you can try and achieve. If when one's working on the African continent with Indonesia, Malaysia, there are different things that one can achieve. And yes, there is going to be a ceiling to those things as long as we haven't addressed that fundamental question of the missing piece of the liberation movement and how that builds out and creates pressure so that the frontline states are no longer complicit.
Daniel, I think it's a great way to end. Thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we can have you on again for the follow-up conversation.
Under different circumstances. Pleasure.
So, guys, that was a sobering, not necessarily depressing discussion with Daniel Levy. We are in a very, very grim moment, and we're not even the ones being bombed and starved and so on. I don't know. What did you think? Sama, what did you think?
I thought it was instructive. I thought the analysis, his point about that Palestinian solidarity, global solidarity with Palestine, what he called the third rail, is not enough to actually it cannot substitute for an actual liberation movement. And I think that's where we are right now. And I think that was an important point. And then his answer to Karim's question about Israeli Jewish society was also intriguing. But I just wonder, what did we learn from this discussion that shifts or changes the analysis, or actually enriches the analysis, or the perspective of where we are today? Karim, what did you think?
No, I agree. I think it's extremely insightful, because I think the idea of trying to understand the way in which, at least for me, the way in which the Israeli Jewish society is something that it's difficult to glean, because I think there's a kind of there are internal mechanisms, internal ways of thinking in which we can try to get some insight rather than simply be on the outside and just keep asking, how is this the case? How does a society become genocidal like this? Is there any nuance? Are we missing something? Is there something that we can't see from the outside? And I don't know. It seems like no.
Karim, there's a history of the Nakba of 1948. There's a history of ethnic cleansing.
But we've gone. I know, but
century
of
stuff. So.
There was a Nakba, then there was all sorts of things, of course, and then there was the whole liberal order, and the business of them being comfortable enough that they could just ignore it and put the occupation and apartheid in the back burner just because it's there, and so they continue in the kind of slow burning process where apartheid is there. Those like Benny Morris kind of sort of wishing or lamenting the fact that the Nakba was not complete, and now maybe these kinds of people see their chance and they want the Nakba to be complete. And yes, it's ongoing.
But really, they say, Karim, they actually say.
Which they say. They say it, so we can talk
No,
about it
paradoxically,
academically.
they deny the Nakba, and they say they want a second Nakba.
Well,
That's the
that's
paradox.
actually no, even more precisely, the first time Israeli officials started using the term Nakba was now in the context of Gaza, saying we need to have a second Nakba. Because before that, they used to deny that there was any Nakba at
Yeah,
all.
I find this interesting because you have the question of the Israelis themselves, and internationally, you now have the resurgence of talking about Nakba. It's now a word that's used. It's a term that's used outside of just Palestinian or historians or things like this. Just like now we talk about apartheid, just like now you talk about genocide, just like now you talk about all these kinds of issues that you would not have been able to talk about before.
Except
So
except in circles of U.S. power. Okay,
no, even the
except in
U.S.
the
power, they're defending it. They're attacking you and saying, "How dare you talk about apartheid? How dare you talk about genocide? How dare you talk about?" They're using the words. They're saying, "How dare you talk about genocide?" But they're using genocide to say that you wouldn't be in that. There wouldn't be the discussion. So in American terms, now you go from people, as I said, like from people like Bernie Sanders, who want to still to this day, who are saying the right things at a certain level in American political discourse, but are still trying to somehow pretend that it's like a Netanyahu issue only, rather than a larger Israeli society issue or Jewish Israeli society issue, and
Bernie
something
Sanders,
much
incidentally,
deeper.
sorry, Kenny, incidentally, Bernie Sanders, who remember back 15, 14, 13 months ago, who refused to, who wouldn't support a ceasefire. Do you remember that?
Yes, of course. But okay, so things change. So
Yeah, no,
in a
you're right.
certain
No,
moment,
things
you can say
change. Yeah.
something, and for politicians, I mean, I'm a little bit different than you in that sense. I can, when you're looking at politicians, I don't expect. I mean, these guys are not, Nelson Mandela. These are not the people I look to see to get some kind of massive moral clarity. That's not how I see politicians. What you see is a change, a shift. And I think that shift is, we need to recognize, and I include AOC, including all those people who say the right things within the American political context and as good as you're going to get from within the system. But the point is, what I'm trying to make is that they're still trying to make it appear that it's a Netanyahu issue, as though if you remove Netanyahu today, you can go back to a more innocent period, a kind of pre-genocide period. And I don't think we see it like this. And I think Daniel kind of, I think, seems to kind of go along with this. That I don't. It's something much deeper than a Netanyahu question. Although Netanyahu is important because he's a bit like Trump, where he dominates. Yeah.
But I have a question for you and for Seti. I mean, don't you think when Daniel was saying that Israel is engaged in overreach or is potentially overreach, don't you see that as basically his trying to hope that that is the case as opposed to actually really believing it?
No, I see it. I agree with that. I agree with that.
Some of you, of course,
I think
some
the
of course
question
it's
of
overreach.
hubris. I think the question of hubris, the question of overreach. I don't think if you see what they wanted to do in South Lebanon, they now have, as I said, Ortega's, who's Trump's envoy to Lebanon, has come here. This is maybe second or even third trip here. She comes to lecture Lebanese and the kind of pro-Israel people are pissed off because the Lebanese president and prime minister and others seem at a certain level to have pushed her back and said, we're not going to go to full, not just we're not going to normalization. What her process is to try to move away from the mechanism based on military coordination with the Israelis and Lebanese army to one where she wants to create, where the Americans want to create these three different political streams. So basically, not direct negotiations. She's failed in this now today, or these last few days. There was a very concerted push, and she said, okay, we're giving one last warning. The point is, there is pushback, even at that political level, even with all the defeatism and all the depression and all this, that the movement from an Israel that is allowed to attack and kill whenever it wants, which they've done, they're still assassinating. The Lebanese have recorded over 1,800 violations of the ceasefire. So that is going on, but their ability to translate that into political gains, that has not yet succeeded. It really hasn't. I'm not saying it won't succeed, but to this day in Lebanon, it hasn't succeeded to the extent that you might think by reading the media and reading Lebanese accounts, you think is already done. It's not. I don't think it is. Syria now, we see this incredible push. They've pushed their occupation. Yes, it's defeatism, but we don't know what's going to happen in Syria in a week or 2 or 6 months or 1 year from now. It's not going to stay like that. So I think they have limited amount of resources. They're trying to push apartheid, genocide, and expansionism all at the same time with full American support. If any one of these things were to change, things will move very quickly, I think.
Yeah, Osama, there's no question and it came up effectively in our conversation with Daniel today, Israeli overreach is a real thing. They think that they're omnipotent and that they are like settler colonial gods or whatever, but they're just not. It's a small society
No,
with
I
a
know they're not
small
gods.
army,
No, for
and
sure, for sure. I know.
but
I
like,
agree.
but somehow this point keeps coming up. They are capable of mass destruction. Yes, they are. What they're doing in Gaza is unspeakable, but that doesn't mean a year and a half they weren't able to accomplish any of their objectives, right?
Yes, I see
So
your point. I see both your points, and I agree with almost everything you both say, except to say that here we are now. How many months has it been? Has it been 18 months of this genocide? And there is not only an escalation, there is not only more impunity than ever before. There's not even the pretense of pretending to do anything but do these kind of horrific massacres of the journalists
yes,
or the
but
kids and all
somehow
that stuff. And the Americans keep paying for it. Cory Booker, 25 hours of a speech, and then he goes and he votes to spend billions of more dollars of our
Some of the
taxpayer money.
political,
Yeah.
but you need to translate that. So politically, they can kill and kill and kill. The political goal is ethnic cleansing, right? That's the political
Yes.
goal. I
Yes.
think we can
Yeah.
agree on this now.
Yeah.
So
100%.
okay, so if the political goal is ethnic cleansing, they have not yet managed that, and hopefully they won't manage it.
But Kenny, they destroyed it. I mean, Gaza has been utterly obliterated.
yes, but
Destroying
that's
and
not
killing and
destroying and
genocide
killing.
is not a political aim.
Look at what the Americans did in Vietnam. For all those years, they killed 3 million people in Vietnam. They still lost the war. It's not about the capacity to kill and destroy. The Israelis are they're the best people in the world at killing and destroying. But that doesn't mean attaining a political objective. If
Well,
they're
I
gonna,
mean, okay,
if they're
that's
this thing
but
about
Sally,
we're gonna take up Gaza, we're gonna break it up. That means putting their army back into Gaza.
fair
They've
enough. But
dropped
I mean, but they've also, as you know, they've expanded in Syria, and they've taken over more
all
of,
of these things are cost free. The things that they're exceptional at doing things that are cost free.
It's
Dropping
not cost free. I
bombs,
mean,
it's
yeah, I mean,
cost
it's not.
free. Dropping bombs from the air, you're not paying for the bombs, you're not paying for the fuel, you're not
They
paying for the
couldn't take
planes.
South Lebanon.
It's all
They could
cost
not
free.
take South Lebanon.
As soon as
With
they couldn't take
50,000
Gaza.
people.
They couldn't take Gaza. As soon as there's a cost, they can't do it. They can't. And what they're doing, this came up in this conversation. It came up in
Guys,
our conversation with
I'm
Elon.
I'm
Hang
partly
on,
playing devil's advocate,
no,
but
I know, but you're also partly not playing
but
devil's advocate.
partly, I'm just so that we're not all sort of in unison on these things, just a bit to make it a little bit more. I mean, but you guys cannot continue and maintain the line. I mean, it's as if you guys are maintaining the line we had at the very beginning of this genocide, and here we are, over almost 2 years into this genocide, with total impunity, with Syria gone, with the Syrian, so the Israeli expansion in Syria, then there's no deterrent for them there. With Lebanon, the weakened severely,
But
with the
things
whole
change.
sort of of course things change, but
You're
of course
setting
things
up
change.
Syria,
But you're,
from a local view. You don't know what's going to happen in Syrian society and how Syria is going to. They are coming after decades of a certain kind of society. It's shifting. The politics are being redone. We have no idea how things are going to go.
no,
You
it's
have a
true.
second.
Yeah, no,
You
you're
also,
absolutely right.
also,
You're right. We
also in
don't know.
Syria, but you also have a second dimension, which is the Turkish, kind of growth inside Syria. You're now leading to a Turkish-Israeli kind of eventual confrontation. That's going to happen if it continues like
Or
this.
Sykes-Picot,
Things change.
an updated version
No,
of Sykes-Picot. Why are you
no,
assuming that
No,
that wouldn't
no.
be the case?
This
they
is
can't
not the British
coexist.
and French
They won't
Empire,
coexist.
Yozaname Osama. It's not. We're not talking about. You're not talking about a great power. You're talking about a very, very seventh-rate power that's utterly, utterly, utterly dependent on foreign assistance. It's not a great power. It acts like it's a great power. It's not a great power. Fundamentally, it's very good at killing people. Yes, that's what they are.
Well,
The
it's a great
world
power in the
masters.
region. In the region, it's a great
Yes,
power.
but even then, as we saw when Iran attacked last year, they had to run to mommy and daddy to help them. They're just don't, their capacity for harm cannot ever be overestimated. What they're doing in Gaza, we all see it. It is unspeakable. The headless children and the bakeries and the people and the slaughter and the hospitals. It's unspeakable what they're
The
doing.
deliberate massacres in Ramadan, and
It's
and the
unbelievable.
Arab and the Muslim world, basically allowing, doing absolutely, virtually, as far as I can tell, nothing. That's what Daniel was talking about. The impunity. They're looking around. They're
Yes,
saying, okay,
but
well,
that doesn't
there's no.
there is total impunity. There's no question about this.
Sama, as I said, What they are very good at doing what they do when there's no price to pay. As soon as there's a price to pay, everything changes, and they are paying a price. They're paying a slow price, which is, first of all, their total loss of legitimacy among a Western public. That's gone. It's gone. The reason why there's so much repression in Western societies now, people get arrested for saying things, is because they've lost the Western
Seti, I
societies.
think this is a debate we're going to have, I think, with future guests, and this is an ongoing discussion. I think you can interpret that either as they've lost legitimacy, which of course I think they have to a large extent with a certain sector. On the other hand, you could also say Western societies themselves have fundamentally either revealed themselves for what they really are, or on the other hand,
why would they
are
need to be,
shifting
why would there need to be
to a more
repression?
fascist model of politics.
No, if that was the case, there wouldn't need to be repression, Osama. The fact that there's so much repression.
Fascism there's no repression in fascism.
No. You're saying that the people themselves want it. No, that's my point. The existence of this mass repression in Western societies, the implosion of our universities and all of our civil society, PEN America, and all these, the AHA and the MLA, all these institutions are in crisis now, because there's a disconnect between what more and more people want and what the state. Yes, the state is captured by the Israelis. It's true, 100%. Cory Booker and all these people do the bidding of AIPAC. Basically, that's not new. But there's a growing disconnect, a growing crisis. Also, by the way, we haven't really talked about this, but Trump is a very unpredictable character. He can have a fit tomorrow.
No, he mentioned it. No, Daniel talked about it at the very beginning.
Yes,
I mean,
at the very beginning.
Who knows? Tomorrow he could change his mind. Just like, look what he's doing with the tariffs. Like, I decided I'm going to do this, even though everybody's saying what you're doing is insane. He can arbitrarily just make up his mind and say, "That's it, boom, we're done." So who knows? Who knows where we're going to go?
I know you're not saying this, Seti.
I have no faith. No. Before
Exactly.
you say it, I have zero faith.
Don't put any faith in
I'm just
Trump,
saying.
That's for sure.
I'm just saying, Israeli omnipotence it's more of an act than a reality, and because there are all these costs that are carrying on. That they're like a drunkard on a binge right now.
Well, they're free riders. They're free riders.
That's what I'm saying.
Guys, I wouldn't say it's all a myth. I'm saying you could say it's sustained and equipped and enabled by both Western and especially U.S. Finances and support and military aid and all that stuff. That's
and
why
repression of dissent
and repression and domestic now, and we see Seti with our students, mass repression, all that stuff.
And in the right wing is split, even in the right wing now with Tucker Carlson and people like this.
We keep saying, yeah, that's we keep threatening to have an episode about the right wing. I mean, I don't know how we would do that.
Actually,
we're not threatening.
Yeah.
I mean, we just need to find the right person.
Yeah, but we're not right wing, so
our contacts on the right are not very good. But
not exactly.
We should try.
All right, guys.
All right, let's stop here. All right, thank you, guys.